Ralph Waldo Emerson is well known for his concept of self-reliance, and this concept lies at the heart of Unitarian Universalism still today. We tend to believe, rightly or wrongly, that individuals have the right to define themselves against the powers of authority, including defining ourselves against the authority of God or other deities. Philosopher Cornell West provides some insight into this aspect of Emerson's saying, "His rapacious individualism and relentless expansionism of the self appear to be motivated by a moral faith in the possibility that goodness and greatness will emerge in the future owing to human efforts." In short, Emerson believed in the ultimate goodness of human beings. So he borrowed an important part of this concept of self-reliance, this concept of the importance of following the promptings of goodness coming from within oneself. He borrowed some of this from a woman named Mary Rotch, R-O-T-C-H. Mary Rotch was born on Nantucket Island off the coast of Massachusetts into a Quaker family in 1777. Her family moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and there, after a time when she was an adult, she became an elder or leader in the New Bedford Quaker meeting. Then in 1823, the New Bedford Quakers were split in two by the conflict between the so-called New Lights and the Old Lights, a controversy that spread through New England Quakerism of that time. Mary was on the side of the liberals. The conservative faction gained control of the New Bedford Quaker meeting, and they ejected Mary from that meeting. So she went and joined the New Bedford Unitarian Church, the minister of which was Orville Dewey, known as something of a public intellectual in his day. And then in 1827, Ralph Waldo Emerson came down to the New Bedford Church as a substitute preacher. It was during this, his first visit to New Bedford, that, quote, Emerson had been deeply impressed by the sight of the leading Quaker of the town, Miss Mary Rotch, quietly leaving the church when the rite of the Lord's Supper was about to be observed, close quote. Most of Emerson's biographers agree that Mary's example influenced him in 1832 when he resigned from the Second Church in Boston, where he was minister. And Emerson resigned from Second Church because, so he said, he could no longer in good conscience preside at communion, which was then a monthly feature at most Unitarian churches. This became the subject of his most famous sermon, and it also became one of his most important theological points, that inner truth is more important than empty ritual. Thus, Mary Rotch had a deep and early theological influence on Emerson. Now, when Emerson came back to New Bedford in the winter and spring of 1833-1834, he got to know Mary Rotch better. At that time, Mary Rotch told the young Emerson something of the controversy between the New Lights and the Old Lights and her part in it, and Emerson wrote in one of his notebooks that she had been, quote, driven inward, driven home, to find an anchor, until she learned to have no choice, to acquiesce without understanding the reason, when she found an obstruction to any particular course of action, close quote. That is to say, she learned how to be self-reliant, to rely on her own inner strength, her own inner light. Emerson would later integrate these theological concepts into his own thinking and writing. Mary Rotch gave Emerson another important theological idea that was encapsulated in a story she told to him. A little girl came to her, to Mary Rotch, and asked if she could do something that was not quite right. Quote, she, Mary, replied, "What does the voice in thee say?" The child went off, and after a time returned to say, "The little voice says no." Close quote. This story affected Emerson greatly. It affirmed for him that each of us can know what is right and what is true if we would just listen to the voice in thee. Many years later, Emerson quoted, or perhaps paraphrased, Mary Rotch in his essay titled Greatness, expressing this same point in a different way. He wrote, "I do not pretend to any commandment or large revelation, but if at any time I form some plan, propose a journey, or a course of conduct, I perhaps find a silent obstacle in my mind that I cannot account for. Very well. I let it lie, thinking it may pass away. But if it do not pass away, I yield to it, obey it. You ask me to describe it. I cannot describe it. It is not an oracle, nor an angel, nor a dream, nor a law. It is too simple to be described. It is but a grain of mustard seed. But such as it is something which the contradiction of all mankind could not shake, and which the consent of all mankind could not confirm." So wrote Emerson in his essay Greatness. This concept lies at the very heart of Mary Roach's theology. When the voice within you tells you not to do something, don't do it. Some might claim that this voice within is the voice of God, but Orville Dewey claimed that, quote, "when speaking of the Supreme Being, she, Mary, would never say God, but only that influence. That influence was constantly with her, and she carried the idea so far as to believe that it prompted her daily action and decided for her every question of duty." Close quote. Mary's theology did not draw a distinction between God and that internal influence which some might call conscience. Indeed, she seems to be telling us that God can be interpreted to mean exactly that inner voice that prompts us towards right action. Once again, this becomes a theological concept of some importance to Emerson. So this Emersonian concept of self-reliance, which lies at the heart of Unitarian Universalism today, is actually a concept that can be traced back to a woman theologian, someone who never published a book, but instead taught her theology through the example of her life and through her conversations with others. And I would suggest that we might do better to take our concept of self-reliance from Mary Rotch than from Ralph Waldo Emerson. First of all, Cornell West has pointed out that Emerson's conception of the worth and dignity of human personality is racially circumscribed. And while Mary Roach's conception of individual worth and dignity was also doubtless racially circumscribed, having been raised a Quaker in southeastern Massachusetts in that time, she was probably more willing than Emerson to ascribe worth and dignity to black persons. A starker difference is that Emerson was quite sexist, both in his personal life and in his writing. Mary Rotch, by contrast, lived her life as if women had just as much worth and dignity as men. Therefore, I'd suggest, if we are going to continue to put self-reliance at the center of Unitarian Universalism, we would do well to go back to Mary Rotch.